In the darkness of a South Carolina night in 1847, while slaveholders slept believing their system was secure, an enslaved preacher named Josiah was committing the most dangerous crime imaginable, teaching black people to read the words that slaveholders claimed would destroy them. And in doing so, he was planting seeds of liberation that no amount of violence could uproot. Before we dive into this extraordinary true story of courage, intelligence, and the transformative power of education, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of black resistance and brilliance. These are the histories that change the world, and every single one deserves to be remembered and celebrated. The story begins not with Josiah's birth into slavery in 1810, but with the moment he discovered that words on a page held power greater than any whip, any chain, any law designed to keep black people in bondage. Josiah was 7 years old, working in the main house of the Cunningham plantation in South Carolina, when he saw the slaveholder's daughter reading a book and laughing at something on the page. The idea that marks on paper could create laughter, could communicate ideas, could hold stories and knowledge, fascinated young Josiah in a way he couldn't articulate. He asked the girl what she was doing, and she looked at him with the casual cruelty of a child raised to believe black people were less than human, and said, "I'm reading, but darkies like you could never learn such things because you don't have the brains for it." That moment planted something in Josiah that would grow into his life's defining purpose. Not anger at the insult, though he felt that too, but a burning determination to prove that the lie of black intellectual inferiority was exactly that, a lie designed to justify an unjust system. From that day forward, Josiah became obsessed with understanding how reading worked, with decoding the mystery of how marks on paper could hold meaning. He watched the slaveholders' children do their lessons, memorizing the shapes of letters and the sounds they made. He studied the family Bible that sat on the parlor table, tracing the letters with his eyes and trying to connect them to the words he heard read aloud during the mandatory Sunday services, where enslaved people were lectured about obedience and contentment with their lot. The process was agonizingly slow because Josiah had to teach himself in stolen moments, had to hide his learning because discovery would mean brutal punishment. South Carolina law explicitly forbade teaching enslaved people to read or write, with harsh penalties for both the teacher and the student. The slaveholders understood something fundamental. Literacy was dangerous to slavery because it allowed enslaved people to access information and ideas beyond what their oppressors wanted them to know, to communicate across distances, to read the abolitionist literature that argued slavery was morally wrong, to forge freedom papers, and most dangerously of all, to read the Bible for themselves and see that it didn't actually endorse slavery the way the slaveholders claimed. By the time Josiah was 12, he had taught himself to read basic words and short sentences, a remarkable achievement for someone with no formal instruction and who had to hide his learning constantly. But reading opened up a world that made his enslavement even more unbearable, because now he could access the ideas of freedom, the arguments against slavery, the knowledge that there were places in the world where people like him weren't considered property. The more Josiah learned, the more he understood the systematic dehumanization that slavery required. The more he recognized the intelligence and capability of enslaved people around him who were denied the tools to develop those qualities, and the more he felt called to do something about it. But what could one enslaved boy do against a system backed by law, violence, and economic power? What weapon did Josiah possess that could strike at the heart of slavery? The answer came to Josiah when he was 15 years old and experienced what he would later describe as a spiritual calling. Working in the fields on a sweltering summer day, Josiah felt an overwhelming sense of purpose wash over him, a certainty that he was meant to preach, to minister to his people, to provide spiritual guidance and hope in the midst of their suffering. But interwoven with that spiritual calling was another purpose, quieter but equally powerful. The calling to teach, to share the literacy he had gained. to give others the tools to liberate their minds even if their bodies remained in chains. These two callings merged in Josiah's mind into a single mission. He would become a preacher, and under the cover of religious instruction, he would secretly teach enslaved people to read. The plan was extraordinarily dangerous and required years of patient groundwork before Josiah could begin executing it. First, he had to establish himself as a preacher, which meant gaining the trust of both the enslaved community and, crucially, the slaveholders who had to permit his activities. Josiah began preaching informally to small groups of enslaved people, delivering sermons that emphasized endurance, faith, and the promise of heavenly reward. Messages that slaveholders approved of because they reinforced submission and acceptance. But woven into those apparently accommodating sermons were subtle threads of resistance, references to biblical stories of liberation like the Exodus, coded language that spoke to the humanity and worth of enslaved people, reminders that God saw them as full human beings regardless of what earthly masters claimed. Josiah's preaching style was powerful and moving, blending the African-American oral traditions he'd grown up with, the biblical knowledge he'd gained from his reading, and a natural charisma that drew people to him. By his early 20s, Josiah had become one of the most sought-after enslaved preachers in the region, invited to speak at different plantations, developing a reputation for sermons that uplifted spirits and strengthened faith. The slaveholders tolerated and even encouraged this because they believed religion made enslaved people more docile, more accepting of their condition. What they didn't understand was that Josiah was building something far more subversive, a network of trust and communication that would become the foundation for his secret school. The Cunningham plantation owner, seeing value in Josiah's preaching abilities, granted him unusual privileges, including limited freedom of movement to preach at neighboring plantations. This was exactly what Josiah had been working toward, because mobility was essential for his true purpose. In 1835, at age 25, Josiah was permitted to build a small praise house, a simple wooden structure where enslaved people could gather for religious services. The praise house was located at the edge of the plantation, far enough from the main house that activities there weren't easily observed. This building would become Josiah's classroom, the site where he would commit the crime of education for the next 15 years. But how could Josiah possibly teach reading without being discovered by the slaveholders who were constantly watching for exactly this kind of subversion? The answer lay in genius-level strategic planning and the use of every advantage Josiah could create. Josiah's method was built on layers of secrecy and misdirection that would have impressed any intelligence operative. The reading lessons were disguised as religious instruction, with the Bible as the primary text, which gave Josiah cover, because even slaveholders accepted that preachers needed to reference Scripture. He held his regular, approved prayer meetings in the early evening when slaveholders expected such gatherings. But after those meetings ended and most participants left, a select few would remain, and that's when the real work began. Josiah had developed a careful vetting process for identifying who could be trusted with the secret of the reading lessons. He looked for people who demonstrated discretion, who had compelling reasons to risk learning, who understood the danger and were willing to accept it. The first person Josiah taught was a woman named Sarah, who was in her 30s and desperate to learn to read so she could teach her own children. Sarah had watched 2 of her older children sold away to plantations in Louisiana, and she was determined that her remaining children would have the mental tools to navigate the world with more agency than she'd possessed. Josiah started Sarah with the alphabet, using techniques he'd developed through his own self-education. He traced letters in the dirt floor of the praise house, letters that could be quickly erased if someone approached. He taught her to associate letters with sounds using songs and memory devices. He had her practice writing in the ash of the fireplace, which left no permanent record. And most importantly, he helped her understand not just the mechanics of reading, but the strategic importance of hiding her knowledge. She could never let slip that she could read, could never be caught looking at printed materials, had to maintain the fiction of illiteracy that the slaveholders expected. Sarah learned to read over the course of about 8 months, an achievement that filled both her and Josiah with profound joy and pride. But more than that, Sarah became Josiah's partner in the work, helping him identify other potential students, assisting with teaching once she'd gained proficiency, and demonstrating to others in the enslaved community that literacy was achievable even for adults who had never had any formal education. The next students came from Sarah's recommendation, her teenage daughter Esther, a young man named Benjamin who worked as a stable hand and wanted to be able to forge travel passes, and an older woman named Grace who simply wanted to read the Bible for herself rather than relying on the slaveholders' interpretation. By 1837, 2 years after starting his secret school, Josiah had successfully taught 8 people to read. The number was small but significant, and each literate person became a node in an expanding network because they could in turn teach others, multiplying the impact of Josiah's work. But 8 was nowhere near the scale Josiah envisioned, and he began to develop more efficient methods, group instruction techniques that would allow him to teach more people simultaneously while maintaining security. He created a system where advanced students helped teach beginners, freeing Josiah to work with multiple groups at different skill levels. He developed a curriculum that progressed from basic letter recognition to word reading, to sentence comprehension to full literacy in carefully structured stages. The Praise House became a center of intellectual activity that the slaveholders never suspected, a place where black minds were being systematically liberated through education even as their bodies remained in bondage. Josiah taught reading, but he also taught mathematics, basic geography, history, all the knowledge he'd accumulated through years of reading everything he could access. He taught critical thinking skills, helping his students analyze what they read, rather than just decode words. He taught them about the abolitionist movement in the North, about states where slavery was illegal, about the philosophical and moral arguments against slavery that slaveholders tried to keep hidden. Every lesson was an act of rebellion, every literate student a living refutation of the lies that slavery depended upon. But with success came increased risk, and by 1840, with over 30 people having passed through Josiah's secret school, the danger of discovery was becoming acute. How much longer could Josiah possibly maintain this operation before someone betrayed the secret or made a mistake that exposed everything? The close calls began in the winter of 1841, when a young student named Thomas was caught by an overseer with a scrap of paper on which he'd been practicing writing letters. Thomas claimed he'd found the paper and was just copying marks he'd seen without understanding them, playing into the stereotype of black people as childlike mimics. The overseer believed this explanation because it confirmed his racist assumptions, but he confiscated the paper and warned Thomas about getting ideas above his station. The incident terrified Josiah because it revealed how easily the entire operation could be exposed by a single careless moment. He gathered all his students and reinforced the security protocols. Never write anything on paper that could be discovered. Never let anyone see you reading. Never discuss the lessons where you might be overheard. And if caught with evidence of literacy, deny everything and claim ignorance. The students understood the stakes. Discovery would mean whipping for the student and potentially execution for Josiah as the teacher. South Carolina had recently passed even harsher laws against slave literacy following the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy of 1822, which had terrified slaveholders throughout the state. The specter of literate enslaved people organizing resistance haunted the slaveholding class, and they responded with draconian punishments designed to terrorize anyone who might consider education as resistance. Josiah knew all this, accepted the risk, and continued teaching because he believed the work was too important to stop. Education was liberation, Knowledge was power, and every person he taught to read was a victory against the system of slavery. By 1845, Josiah estimated he had taught reading to approximately 70 people, with varying degrees of proficiency. Some were fully literate and capable of reading complex texts, while others had basic skills that allowed them to read simple words and sentences. But all of them had something they didn't have before: access to the written word, the ability to learn independently through reading, the mental tools to understand their world more completely. The impact extended beyond just those 70 individuals because literate enslaved people could share what they read with others, could pass on knowledge orally, could teach their own children in secret. Josiah's school was creating ripples that spread far beyond the praise house where the lessons occurred. The students represented a cross-section of the plantation's enslaved population. Field workers and house servants, young people and old, men and women, the deeply religious and the skeptical. What united them was the hunger for knowledge and the courage to risk punishment to obtain it. Among them was a woman named Martha, who learned to read at age 52, proving that age was no barrier to education. There was a teenage boy named Isaiah who had such a natural aptitude that he progressed from illiterate to fluent reader in just 4 months. There was a man named Samuel who used his reading skills to forge passes that allowed enslaved people to visit family on neighboring plantations, expanding their world beyond the narrow boundaries slaveholders tried to enforce. Each student had their own motivation for risking the danger of learning. For some it was practical. The ability to read meant better opportunities to navigate the slave system, to understand documents, to forge papers if they decided to escape. For others it was deeply personal. They wanted to read the Bible themselves, to form their own understanding of Scripture rather than accepting the slaveholders' self-serving interpretation. For still others it was aspirational. They believed that education would be crucial in freedom if they ever achieved it, and they wanted to be prepared for that possibility. And for all of them, there was the simple human desire to develop their minds, to access the world of ideas and knowledge that slavery tried to deny them. Josiah watched his students grow not just in literacy, but in confidence and self-conception. Learning to read changed how they saw themselves, undermined the internalized oppression that slavery tried to create, and reinforced their sense of themselves as intelligent, capable human beings rather than the subhuman property that slavery claimed them to be. This psychological transformation was perhaps even more important than the practical skills of literacy, because it armed people with the mental resistance needed to survive slavery without being spiritually destroyed by it. Josiah saw his teaching work as both practical skill building and spiritual ministry, both preparing people for potential freedom and helping them maintain their humanity within slavery. But the weight of the secret was heavy, and Josiah lived with constant fear of discovery and the consequences that would follow. Every knock on the praise house door during lesson time made his heart race. Every suspicious glance from an overseer made him wonder if they'd been found out. Every new student represented another person who could betray the secret intentionally or accidentally. The stress was immense, aging Josiah prematurely, giving him an ulcer that caused chronic pain, leaving him exhausted and anxious in ways he couldn't show because appearing confident was essential to maintaining the student's courage. Then, in the spring of 1847, the disaster Josiah had feared for 12 years finally occurred. A student who had recently started lessons was caught with a stolen book and, under the threat of brutal punishment, revealed the existence of Josiah's secret school. The slaveholder who owned that student immediately informed Cunningham, and within hours, a group of white men descended on the praise house where Josiah was conducting an evening prayer meeting. The reading lessons had ended hours earlier, and there was no physical evidence in the building, but the accusation alone was enough. Josiah was seized, dragged to the main house, and chained while Cunningham decided what to do with him. Was this the end of everything Josiah had built, the end of his freedom and possibly his life? Or could he somehow talk his way out of this disaster? The interrogation was brutal. with Cunningham and several other slaveholders demanding that Josiah confess to teaching slaves to read. Josiah deployed every ounce of strategic thinking he possessed, denying everything, acting confused by the accusations, suggesting that the informant must have misunderstood his religious instruction as something more sinister. He pointed out that there was no physical evidence, no books hidden in the praise house, no papers with writing, no slates or learning materials. He reminded Cunningham that he'd been a faithful preacher for over a decade, that his sermons emphasized exactly the submissive content that slaveholders approved of, that he'd never given any indication of rebellious intent. Most effectively, he suggested that the accusation came from a troublemaker trying to cause problems, and that punishing Josiah without evidence would be unjust and would deprive the plantation of valuable religious services that kept the enslaved population spiritually controlled. Cunningham was deeply suspicious but also uncertain. Josiah had indeed been a seemingly model slave for decades. His preaching did appear to reinforce submission, and there genuinely was no physical evidence of a secret school. The informant's testimony was the only evidence, and that person was considered generally unreliable and troublesome. Moreover, several other slaveholders vouched for Josiah, arguing that his preaching on their plantations had been beneficial and that they'd never seen any indication of literacy instruction. After 2 days of deliberation, Cunningham made a decision. He wouldn't execute Josiah, but he would severely punish him as a warning, would prohibit him from preaching for 6 months, and would keep him under much closer surveillance going forward. The punishment was 30 lashes, a brutal beating that left Josiah's back torn and bloody, that caused pain so severe he could barely move for weeks. But Josiah had survived, and more importantly, he'd protected his students by refusing to confirm the accusation, even under torture. None of the other students were punished because Cunningham couldn't identify them without Josiah's cooperation, and the informant only knew about the secret school in general terms, not specific participants. The network Josiah had built remained intact, though dormant during his 6-month prohibition from preaching and the recovery period from his beating. During those months of forced inactivity, Josiah had time to reflect on what he'd accomplished and what he still hoped to achieve. He'd taught approximately 75 people to read over 12 years, a remarkable achievement, but still far from the 100 he'd dreamed of reaching. The recent disaster had shown how fragile the entire operation was, how dependent on secrecy and luck, how vulnerable to exposure through a single betrayal. A less determined person might have decided the risk was too great and abandoned the teaching work. But Josiah's commitment hadn't wavered. If anything, the punishment had strengthened his resolve because it had shown him that the slaveholders feared black literacy enough to respond with violence, which meant literacy really was the powerful weapon he'd always believed it to be. When Josiah resumed preaching in late 1847, he did so under much closer surveillance, with overseers occasionally attending his services, with restrictions on where and when he could hold meetings. But Josiah was patient and strategic, rebuilding trust slowly, being extra cautious about security, making no moves that would raise suspicion. He didn't resume the reading lessons immediately, instead waiting months until the heightened surveillance relaxed, until he was confident the operation could continue safely. And when he finally did restart the secret school in early 1848, he implemented even stricter security measures, smaller class sizes, more careful vetting of students, absolute prohibition on any written materials that could be discovered as evidence. The work continued through 1848, 1849, and into 1850, with Josiah adding approximately 5 to 8 new literate students each year. The pace was slower than before the exposure, but it was sustainable and secure, and Josiah was approaching his goal of 100 total students. By the summer of 1850, Josiah calculated that he had taught 97 people to read over 15 years of secret instruction. 3 more students would bring him to the symbolic milestone of 100, a number that felt significant not because it was magic, but because it represented the scope and impact of one person's committed resistance to slavery's dehumanization. But would Josiah be able to reach that milestone, or would time run out before he could teach those final 3 students? And what would happen to the secret school and all the literate students once Josiah was no longer able to continue the work? The 98th, 99th, and 100th students all came from the same family, a mother named Dinah and her 2 teenage children, Jacob and Miriam. Dinah approached Josiah in the fall of 1850 with a specific request. She wanted her family to learn to read because they were planning to escape to the north, and literacy would be crucial for their survival as fugitives. Teaching people who were planning to run was especially dangerous because if they were caught, they might reveal Josiah's instruction under torture. But Josiah had never turned away anyone with genuine hunger for knowledge and courage to risk learning. So he agreed to teach Dinah's family, understanding that these would be his final students, and that reaching 100 felt like a fitting conclusion to 15 years of dangerous work. The instruction took place over 4 intense months, with Dinah, Jacob, and Miriam studying with a focus and dedication that came from knowing their freedom might depend on the skills they were acquiring. Josiah taught them not just reading, but also writing, mathematics, geography of the route north, strategies for evading capture, and how to present themselves as free black people traveling legitimately. By early 1851, all 3 were literate and prepared for their escape attempt, and Josiah had achieved his goal of teaching 100 people to read over 15 years of secret instruction. The symbolic significance of reaching 100 filled Josiah with profound satisfaction, not because the number itself mattered, but because it represented a meaningful impact on his community, a legacy that would survive him, a victory against the system of slavery that had tried to keep his people in ignorance. Dinah, Jacob, and Miriam escaped in March 1851, and Josiah never learned whether they successfully reached freedom or were captured and returned to slavery. The uncertainty was agonizing, but it was the reality of Underground Railroad assistance. You helped people as much as you could, then released them to their own journey with no way to follow their progress. Josiah held their fate in his prayers and hoped that the education he'd provided had contributed to their survival, had given them advantages that illiterate fugitives wouldn't possess, had armed them with tools for navigating a hostile world. After reaching his goal of 100 students, Josiah continued preaching, but stopped taking new reading students. He was now 41 years old, worn down by decades of slavery and the stress of maintaining his secret school, his body bearing the scars of his punishment and countless other brutalities. He'd accomplished something extraordinary, had struck a meaningful blow against slavery's attempt to enforce ignorance, had demonstrated that black people possessed the intellectual capability that slaveholders denied. His 100 students represented just a fraction of the millions held in slavery, but they also represented the principle that resistance was possible, that one committed individual could make a difference, that education could be a weapon against oppression. The students Josiah had taught went on to use their literacy in various ways. Some taught their own children and other enslaved people, multiplying Josiah's impact beyond the initial 100. Some used their reading skills to access information about the abolitionist movement and plan their own escapes. Some simply read the Bible for themselves and formed spiritual understandings not mediated by slaveholders' self-serving interpretations. Some forged passes and freedom papers, helping themselves and others navigate the slave system more effectively. And all of them carried themselves with the confidence and self-knowledge that literacy provided, internally rejecting the lies of black inferiority, even when they had to outwardly perform the subservience that slavery demanded. Josiah lived to see the Civil War begin in 1861, lived to see Union forces arrive in South Carolina in 1862, lived to experience the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 that theoretically freed all enslaved people in Confederate territory. He was 53 years old when freedom came, and one of his first acts as a legally free man was to openly establish a school for formerly enslaved people, bringing into the light the teaching work he'd done in secret for 15 years. The school attracted dozens of students of all ages, people hungry for the education that slavery had denied them, and Josiah taught them with the same patience and skill he'd developed during the secret years. Among his students were several people he'd taught covertly before the war, who could now openly acknowledge their literacy and help teach others. Josiah's school operated until his death in 1869 at age 59, his body finally giving out after nearly 6 decades of enslavement's brutalities and the strain of his resistance work. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, many of them former students or the children of former students, all of them aware that Josiah had given them a gift that couldn't be taken away, the ability to read, to learn, to access knowledge independently. They understood that Josiah's teaching had been an act of resistance as significant as physical rebellion, that education was liberation, that every person he'd taught to read was a victory against slavery's attempt to destroy black humanity. The legacy of Josiah's secret school extended far beyond the individual students he taught. His work demonstrated that enslaved people were actively resisting their oppression in countless ways, that submission was a survival strategy rather than acceptance, that black people never believed the lies about their inferiority and were constantly seeking ways to develop and demonstrate their intelligence. The very existence of secret schools throughout the South proved that literacy laws were impossible to fully enforce, that human hunger for knowledge couldn't be completely suppressed by violence and legal prohibition. Every enslaved person who learned to read, despite the laws forbidding it, was living proof that slavery was an unjust system that had to be maintained through force because it contradicted human nature's drive toward freedom and self-development. Josiah's story also illustrates the crucial role that black people played in their own liberation. The dominant narrative of American slavery often centers white abolitionists as the primary opponents of slavery, obscuring the constant resistance that enslaved people themselves were mounting. But the historical record shows that enslaved people resisted in countless ways, from work slowdowns and tool breaking to escape and rebellion, from maintaining African cultural traditions to creating new forms of resistance like secret schools. They weren't passive victims waiting to be rescued, but active agents fighting for their own freedom, using whatever tools they could access. And education was one of the most powerful of those tools. The courage required to maintain a secret school for 15 years, risking torture and execution, is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Every single lesson Josiah taught was an act of extraordinary bravery. Every student who chose to learn was making a decision that could cost them their life. And the collective commitment to education, despite the danger, stands as one of the most inspiring examples of resistance in American history. When we remember that enslaved people were teaching each other to read in secret throughout the South, that there were dozens or hundreds of people like Josiah conducting covert education, that thousands of enslaved people achieved literacy despite laws designed to prevent it, we get a glimpse of the massive, organized, sustained resistance that slavery provoked among those it claimed to own. What would Josiah think if he could see the world today, where black literacy is taken for granted, where the descendants of enslaved people attend universities and write books and teach in schools? Would he feel that his sacrifice had been worth it? That the 100 people he taught had made a difference? The answer is surely yes, because Josiah understood something fundamental, that change happens through accumulated small victories, that liberating one mind at a time eventually creates critical mass for systemic transformation. That education is generational work where the impact compounds over time. The literate students Josiah taught in secret before the Civil War had literate children who eventually had descendants attending integrated schools, achieving advanced degrees, and accessing opportunities that Josiah could barely imagine. That lineage of education traces back to those secret lessons in the Praise House, to Josiah's commitment to teaching despite the danger, to the decision to use education as a weapon against oppression. The praise house where Josiah taught is long gone, torn down or collapsed into the South Carolina soil, leaving no physical trace of the remarkable events that occurred there. But the impact of what happened in that simple wooden building reverberates through time. Lives on in descendants who don't know Josiah's name, but who benefit from the education tradition he was part of building, who carry forward the commitment to learning and self-development that enslaved people maintained despite every attempt to destroy it. The praise house was hallowed ground, consecrated not by religious ceremony, but by the courage and determination of people who risked everything to learn, who refused to accept the intellectual imprisonment that slavery tried to impose, who believed that their minds belonged to them, even when their bodies were claimed as property. Josiah's life raises profound questions about what freedom actually means and when it begins. Was Josiah free during those years when he was legally enslaved, but was educating himself and others, developing and deploying his intelligence in service of resistance? Was he more free than slaveholders who had legal liberty, but whose minds were imprisoned by racism and whose humanity was corroded by the act of enslaving others? Freedom is often conceived as purely legal status, but Josiah's story suggests it's also a state of mind, a practice of resistance, a refusal to be defined by oppression, even when you can't escape it physically. The literate enslaved people Josiah taught were mentally liberated before they were legally freed, had claimed their intellectual autonomy before the law recognized their humanity, had achieved a form of freedom that no amount of violence could completely destroy. The story of the enslaved preacher who secretly taught 100 people to read is ultimately a story about the indomitable nature of the human spirit, about the hunger for knowledge that no amount of oppression can fully extinguish, about the fact that education is inherently liberating because it arms people with tools to understand and challenge their oppression. Josiah wasn't a superhuman figure, but an ordinary man who made an extraordinary commitment, who used the intelligence and courage he possessed to strike back against the system that claimed to own him, who understood that teaching reading was an act of warfare against slavery's ideological foundations. His weapon was the alphabet. His battlefield was a praise house. His soldiers were the 100 students who risked punishment to learn, and his victory was measured in literate minds that slavery couldn't keep ignorant. When we honor Josiah today, we're honoring not just one man, but all the secret teachers, all the clandestine students, all the people throughout history who have understood that education is liberation and who have fought for access to knowledge despite systems designed to keep them ignorant. We're acknowledging that the fight against oppression takes many forms, that intellectual resistance is as important as physical resistance, that teachers are freedom fighters when they operate in contexts where education is prohibited or denied. And we're committing ourselves to the ongoing work of education as liberation, to ensuring that everyone has access to the tools of knowledge, to breaking down the barriers that still exist between people and education. The 100 people Josiah taught represent thousands more who were taught by other secret instructors, who taught themselves through extraordinary effort, who passed literacy down through generations despite every obstacle. They represent the principle that human beings will seek knowledge and self-development even when doing so is criminalized. That you cannot permanently imprison the mind even when you can imprison the body. That education is a form of power that, once acquired, cannot be fully taken away. Every one of those 100 literate students was a defeat for slavery, a crack in the system's foundation, a seed of liberation that would eventually contribute to slavery's destruction. Josiah's legacy calls us to remember that freedom is not just given but taken, not just legal status but mental state, not just individual condition but collective practice. It challenges us to think about what we're doing with the educational opportunities that people like Josiah died to access, whether we're using our knowledge in service of liberation or in service of systems that perpetuate oppression. It asks us to consider who is being denied education today, what barriers exist between people and knowledge, what our responsibility is to continue the work that Josiah began. And it reminds us that one committed person can make a profound difference, that teaching is sacred work, that resistance takes many forms, and that intellectual resistance has proven throughout history to be among the most sustainable and transformative. The final image of Josiah's story is not of an enslaved man being beaten or degraded, but of a teacher standing before students in a secret classroom, pointing to letters traced in ash, watching understanding dawn in eyes that had been told they weren't capable of learning, witnessing the transformation that literacy creates. That image of black people educating themselves despite prohibitions, of knowledge being passed from teacher to student in defiance of unjust laws, of minds being liberated before bodies could be. That image is the true legacy of the enslaved preacher who secretly taught 100 to read. It's an image of resistance, dignity, brilliance, and the unstoppable human drive toward freedom and self-development that no amount of violence or oppression can permanently destroy. May we honor Josiah and all the secret teachers by continuing their work, by fighting for educational justice, by understanding that literacy is liberation and that teaching is one of the most powerful forms of resistance available to those fighting oppression.